My name is Ryan Quint. I'm a park ranger here at the park. We're joined by a few others. My colleague John over here. We have a park volunteer, Ben, I think, right here. And then a couple other park rangers, Beth and Quincy, are in hand. Point being, if something is wrong, find one of us, right? If you need anything, have any questions, please feel free to ask any of us. We have a little bit of a walk ahead of ourselves today, not too far. You're basically looking at the whole path right now. We're going to start here, go down to the bottoms, and then walk back. Not a whole lot to get started, but talking about the Battle of the Wilderness, right? How does it get started? Why does it get started? What happens? And we're going to frame our conversation today around a pretty important question every one of us has to deal with in our everyday lives. You can be a Civil War general, you cannot be a Civil War general. This has happened to you, right? What do you do when nothing seems to go right? Right? How do you react when almost everything simultaneously, in fact, goes wrong? How do they react to it? How do you react to it in your daily life? And began to spit fire and lead at us. Right? And so with that, right, I think we can say that everything's not going quite according to plan. The enemy is where they're not supposed to be. Why are there so many people shooting at us? This wasn't supposed to happen. What happens now? And to do that, to talk about what happens now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague John over there. He's going to take it from here.
It's about, we're getting into noon, the early afternoon of May the 5th, 1864. Meade has ordered Gouverneur K. Warren to attack the Confederate battle line. Grant has encouraged this order by Meade. Grant is expecting the Army of the Potomac to hop to it, to really put the hurt on the Army of Northern Virginia, and hours go by and nothing happens. Grant is used to a much more energetic style of warfare, shall we say, out west, when attacks are ordered, attacks are given. He starts putting pressure on Meade to really push the Army of the Potomac into action. Meade also is arguably a much more aggressive general than the Army of the Potomac is used to up to this point. Meade is rather famous for his temper. After hours of pressure under Grant, Meade's temper snaps. He calls Warren to account, orders him, summons him to his headquarters. He says apparently some very not nice things to Warren, and Warren is finally pushed into the assault after noon. But in a sense, what kind of happens here, in a way, is kind of a nightmare scenario for Warren. Warren did actually have some good reasons for wanting to delay the assault. He didn't really know what was in front of him. Some of his subordinates were dragging their own feet in getting their lines arranged and ready for the assault. He wanted to wait for reinforcements so he could extend his battle line and attack more men with a more coherent force. At the same time, Grant was used to hitting hard, hitting fast, hitting often, and kind of figuring things out from there.
And again, nothing is quite going right for either army, right? You have the U.S. Army's attacks kind of going on with one shoe on and one shoe off. You have Confederate forces breaking in the middle. John Jones is now lying dead in the intersection, right? That's less than ideal if you're a Confederate officer and you're watching a brigade commander get killed. And this swirling mass of confusion. Neither side can really lay claim to victory at this moment in time, right? So what needs to happen now? And what's going to kind of decide the fate of this part of the battlefield, at least, is who makes the first decisive action, right? Is it going to be the U.S. Army? No. Warren does not have enough support on hand. Other corps are too far away. And so for the time being, Charles Griffin's division and James Wadsworth's division are basically it. They're on their own. There's no help coming. But for Confederates, there's help coming up behind them. Richard Ewell's column has been marching down the turnpike for some time. Richard Ewell has just lost one of his family members. One of his family members is killed at the same time John Jones is killed. He does not have time to mourn him, however. He has to ride back and find reinforcements as quickly as he can. And he finds them in the form of a brigade of Georgians, led by John B. Gordon, brigade of Alabamians, led by Cullen Battle, brigade of more Georgians, led by George Doles, and these Confederate forces are rushed forward. Ewell tells Gordon, at least, that the day is ruined. You must come up and support. These Federal forces who have already fought their way across this field, Federal forces who have already become disorganized in the woods, now have Confederates converging on them from all different sides, right? They even have an angry woman yelling at them. Not too far south of us is the Higgerson farm. Amelia Higgerson is standing in her front yard with a rolling pin, shaking it at them. Earlier in the day, she had jawed back and forth with some Pennsylvanians for marching through her vegetable garden, and they give it back to her, and she says, "It's all right, you'll be coming back here directly." And here they come, being pushed back by these Confederates, and there she is with her rolling pin in hand.
Is that the remnants of the house up on top of that little rise?
Sure is. Georgia, one of Gordon's brigade, gives a good indication of what this place must have sounded like and felt like when he writes that they began to fire at us and we at them. I never heard such a yell as we raised. We could scarcely hear our guns as they fired, and we could hardly tell when our guns were fired, but only for the jar it gave us. Right? So much noise and so much confusion. The only way to know the gun went off is that pounding in your shoulder. Now, we've got our cannons behind us. Right? You can see across the road there, the cannon on display is indicative of Battery D of the New York Light Artillery. A section of guns, so 2 guns and then ultimately others brought up, commanded by Captain George Winslow and his lieutenant, a man named Shelton. Why are those guns important? Well, they've been firing up the hill in direct artillery support, and now you have Confederates coming up over the verge of the hill, and you look down at those guns, and if you're a Confederate soldier in that situation, what do you want to do?
Capture the gun.
Take those guns until you begin to sweep down this hill. A little bit faster than we just did, but you know, they're sweeping down the hill, right? And fighting is breaking out, and the gunners are swinging their sponge rammers as weapons. And a Union staff officer watching the fighting from the far end gives an indication of what that would be like. He says it was at this juncture, pursued by Gordon's, Dole's, and Battle's brigades, came back General Bartlett's men, almost in a panic. They rushed into the field and actually ran over the North Carolinians about the guns, many of whom had taken refuge in the gully. We're kind of in the gully now, and then it runs on the far side of the road as well. So this kind of dry creek bed, you're going to have soldiers packed in on top of it. And we just gave you some Confederate units coming down the hill and fighting in this confusion. And so, again, we ask you, right, what do you do when nothing goes right? When everything is off on the wrong foot, right? If you're a Confederate and you're going into this battle with the hope of, if all we need to do is turn back Grant, right? Extremely high hopes for the Confederacy. All they had to do was beat this one last boss battle, right? They've beaten George McClellan and Ambrose Burnside and Joe Hooker and all of that. U.S. Grant's the last domino. Beat him and the war could still be won. And John Worsham of the 21st Virginia kind of puts that to words when he says the giants had met and Grant had been worsted in his first encounter, right? So the battle lines are drawn. More fighting will be required, right? Some of you, when something goes wrong, might vent yourself in frustration. You might yell at people. You might yell at your boss, right? Charles Griffin, division commander here, very famously hops on his horse and rides back to the headquarters knoll, where George Meade is and Ulysses S. Grant are, and Griffin, a division commander, gets in Meade's face and says, "Hi, how you doing?" No, it doesn't quite say that, does it? He vents his frustration. He's letting curses and profanity out. Spit's flying from his mouth. His cheeks are red. And then he gets on his horse and rides back. Right? Sometimes you just need a good yell, right? So when I yell at Beth later, we'll be okay. She'll know where I'm coming from, right? And Grant watching that is horrified. And he goes up to Meade and he says, "Who is this General Gregg? And why does he talk this way? You should have him arrested." And Meade says his name's Griffin, not Gregg. And it's just his way of talking. So
Tapp Field, some of the people who lived here, and some of the events that took place here during the Battle of the Wilderness, and the history of the site and where it fits into the South, into Virginia before the Civil War. So, and I will also say, we will occasionally have points in this program where I ask you all questions. They're not hypothetical, or some of them are hypothetical. They're not rhetorical. That's the word I was looking for. And I'm perfectly comfortable with awkward silence, so I will stare at everyone until I get some feedback. But we'll start with one that's kind of an easy one, maybe kind of a just get ourselves in the right mindset, right? When you think about the South before the Civil War, what are some things that you think about?
Cotton.
Tobacco.
Virginia.
Tobacco. Slavery. Heavily agricultural. Plantations. Farms and plantations.
Class differences.
Yeah. I like that. Small tenant farmers.
West Virginia was still attached.
West Virginia.
Only got one. Yes, they're getting longer.
We are here at the home site, and there's a little sign behind us that if you want to kind of take a peek at as we're walking back, the Tapp's home site. The house itself no longer stands, the antebellum house here. The Tapps were not the first family to live in this house. It was, just to describe it, it was a log structure, no siding, a single window on the front, and the chimney on the side. It's a very simple house. It's honestly kind of a house that looks like if you told a child to draw a house, it'd be like this one room kind of house.
Which was to siphon troops off of a full division off of the U.S. 5th Corps to outflank the Confederate 3rd Corps under E. Hill down here, and to attack the Confederate flank down here full force, collapsing in an entire half of the Confederate Army. Now, Lee and his troops end up making a mistake. Overnight, assuming that Longstreet's Corps, which was still about a day's march away, would be here before midnight, Lee tells A.P. Hill, commanding the positions here, that he wouldn't have to do much fighting in the morning. A.P. Hill tells his men not to worry about reorganizing or re-entrenching. After a day's fight, when the morning comes, Longstreet's not here yet. 25,000 U.S. troopers pop out of the woods screaming at the top of their lungs, and A.P. Hill's entire corps essentially collapses. So Robert E. Lee, his headquarters is here in this field, who had chosen this fight, essentially watches as a third of his army disintegrates in front of him.
What was the direction the Union took?
U.S. is coming from behind me and from my right. So that's what's happening. So the U.S. Second Corps is coming from their line along the Brock Road. And then Wadsworth's division of the U.S. Fifth Corps is actually coming from their north. So the Confederate Third Corps is getting frontally assaulted by the 20,000 men, give or take, of the U.S. Second Corps, while getting hit outflanked from the north by an entire division of the U.S. Fifth Corps, while being largely unorganized and unentrenched. You know, it's probably a little bit concerned. At one point, probably the only thing between the functional collapse of his army and potentially the end of the war, at least here in Virginia, is a line of 16 guns. Well, there's arguments over exactly how many guns, but a line of guns here in the field, essentially where we're standing right now, blasting away at the U.S. troops advancing from the tree line, slowing down the U.S. advance. Hogue's battalion of artillery. Now, just in the nick of time, Robert E. Lee is going to look down the road. He's going to see fresh Confederate troops marching in. He's going to ride over, he's going to ask them who they are. Tell them, sir, where are the Texas Brigade? The only Texans in the Army of Northern Virginia belong to Longstreet's First Corps. Longstreet has finally arrived. With Longstreet's arrival, Lee knows that hopefully the army is now saved. Longstreet, taking command of the field, begins funneling brigades into line, begins to blunt the U.S. offense. Now, in the attack, the U.S. troops have become almost as disorganized as the Confederate retreat. Part of the problem was that as Wadsworth's division had come down, the Confederates had actually given way so quickly that Wadsworth's men started running into Hancock's men. So you've got U.S. troops running into retreating Confederates and advancing U.S. troops all at once. It becomes a massive snarl in the woods, which buys the Confederates time they need to start reorganizing themselves. Longstreet begins to form a counterattack. As Lee sees the Texans come in, he tells the commander of the Texas Brigade to tell his men that they are charging under the eye of Robert E. Lee, and that the Texans always move them. The Texans begin to charge, and as they start coming out of the woodline and march through the gun line here, suddenly they realize, hey, Lee is still with us. Lee is charging with the brigade. Does anyone notice a problem with that? Going forward until you go back. Several accounts speak of some of the Texans grabbing the reins of Lee's horse to try and pull him to the rear, and Lee refusing, telling them to stop, or fighting, or in some accounts even say of him literally, like physically trying to fight them off. Eventually, it is the brigade commander who comes up to Lee and basically tells Lee, "You need to leave, sir." At the same time, Longstreet's chief of staff, Colonel Venable, also sees this happen and goes to Longstreet and says, "Longstreet, General Lee's trying to lead a brigade in a charge. So Longstreet finds Lee as Lee is coming back from the brigade, and it says to Lee, and according to Venable, says to Lee that he can take over the command, that he can rebuild the Confederate battle line if he is given a free hand. But if he is not needed, he will leave. So Lee goes back to his headquarters.
Thank you for watching our video. Please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, please leave those in the comment section. We'll work on getting them out to you as soon as possible.